In rural areas, you may or may not have access to other opportunities, right? Higher paying jobs that don't require a college education. And so I think a lot of rural students are actually thinking about that of like, do I need post-secondary education?
Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Office Hours, where we explore the key trends shaping higher ed and what these trends mean for students and families. I'm really excited about today's episode with Andrew Moe Hoffman, where we discussed rural college admissions and rural college access. In this episode, Andrew gave some really great advice for rural students and families, as well as admissions officers who are looking to recruit more rural students. We touched upon some of the common misconceptions that rural students might have about the admissions process and gave some really practical tips to get ahead. Let's dive in. Hey everyone, I'm Will Geiger, co-founder of Scholarships 360, and I'm really excited for our conversation today. I'm joined by Dr. Andrew Moe Hoffman. Andrew is a former director of admissions at Swarthmore College. He's also spent some time in the Vanderbilt admissions office. He's currently the founder of Ask Dr. Hoffman, a consulting firm that helps students and parents through the admissions process, and also a senior director at Matriculate, which is a national college access organization that provides support to high-achieving low-income students. Today, I'm really excited to talk to Andrew about rural college admissions. So welcome, Andrew.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I'm excited. I've done several podcasts and different things around rural college access. So really excited to speak with you about this.
Yeah, I know when we first talked, you mentioned you were doing rural college admissions and rural access before it was
Hmm.
cool. Um, I know it's something that's been, getting a lot more attention, I think, with like the
Yep.
STARS College
Yep.
Network. Um, so for anyone who's not familiar, why do you think this is such an important issue in higher ed? And maybe what's one thing that would be surprising to folks about the admissions process for rural students?
Yeah, so I think this is so important for college admissions. I mean, I live in the selective admissions world, but it honestly cuts across different sectors of post-secondary education. I think it's so important because rural perspectives, small town perspectives are underrepresented in higher education, right? So when we talk about the hot topic DEI, like that is part of this agenda and this part of higher ed is looking at different perspectives and ensuring that those perspectives are represented in classrooms, right? So what we know is that around 20 to 25% of the population are coming from rural and small town areas in the United States. It's hard to define, quite honestly, because rural is usually defined in proximity to urban spaces, which is a whole problem in itself. But around 20 to 25%, let's just say, about half of school districts are in rural areas in the US, and that accounts for about 10,000 high schools across the country. So it really is a pretty large footprint, quite honestly. It's not the majority, of course, but it's a pretty large footprint. And so I think it's really important that those perspectives, those lived experiences are represented in classrooms. And so when we're talking about access to healthcare, we're talking about what is your lived experience as a rural student and calling for an ambulance that it might be 45 minutes to an hour away. And what does that do, right? It's obviously in the news right now of rural hospitals and possibly, not being funded to the extent that they have been in the past. And so I think those perspectives are really important. And that's why admission officers and colleges should really care about this. I think that all students also should have all the options on the table in front of them to understand, like, what is my option after high school? It might be career, it might be military, it might be 2 year or 4 year, but we don't want to relegate students to a particular after college experience just because you don't have access, maybe physical access or geographic access to the same networks as other students, right? I think the surprising, if we have listeners that are rural, this might not be super surprising, but those that are maybe not from this world, I think it can be surprising that Rural students graduate high school at the highest rates in the country compared to urban and suburban peers, but they go to college at the lowest rates. And so when we're talking about that underrepresentation, we're often usually seeing rural students that are more often the case at community colleges and less selective institutions, maybe versus the more selective institutions, right? We don't have a firm number on the number of rural students represented at Dartmouth and Cornell and Swarthmore and others. It's probably around 5 to 7% though, right? And so if we compare that with the population of 20 to 25%, we're talking about underrepresentation.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and what a fascinating paradox of graduation rate versus attending college, and just
Mhm.
you'd think that those two things would be very correlated, but
Mhm.
clearly that's not always the case. Um, I know one of when I'm a former college counselor as well, and one of the really fun parts of the admissions process on that end is helping students sometimes discover or reveal what's really unique about themselves in the admissions process.
Mhm.
I think that that's just a way of can be a real like opportunity to demonstrate a strength
Mhm.
in the for an admissions committee. um, do you think that there's specific strengths that maybe rural students are overlooking, that colleges do care about, or just ways of framing their experience, that might make it resonate more?
Yeah, I think this is a really important framing, quite honestly, because I think when we talk about college access, we're often, and this is in the classroom and my doctorate and talking about higher ed and who has access to higher ed, we often frame this in a deficit mindset, like what is wrong with these communities or what are the challenges? And like you can't ignore the challenges, obviously, but we also want to think about this from an asset based approach. And what do these students really bring to the table, right? And what we know from research is that students are often bringing really strong ties to their family, to their school, to their community. That's an important aspect, right? We also know that students are bringing grit, resilience, determination, a lot of hardworking students in rural and small town areas. It doesn't mean that there aren't hardworking students in urban and suburban areas, but we do find this in research as well. Strong academic performance, and that's obviously a major plus for colleges to find those students that can do the academic work while they're in college. Rural students sometimes are more connected to small businesses and initiatives, right? When we think about rural, we sometimes think farmland and contributing in that way. And agriculture is obviously a main staple in rural communities, but that's not the only piece, right? There's fisheries, there's small businesses like restaurants. Your family might be the town nurse, and so, really thinking about those ties and bringing again those perspectives to the classroom. Students also can sometimes have really unique co curricular and extracurricular experiences, something that's not represented as much depending on the institution. So, um, these are sometimes generalizations, but some rural students are maybe more connected to faith or their church. I will tell you, when I was at Swarthmore, it was very rare to see students who were really religious in our applicant pool, and bringing that experience could be an interesting perspective. Again, generalizations, but
Right.
FFA, Future Farmers of America, can often be pretty popular. It was at my high school. It was a pretty large organization. We were known as Cow Pie High because we had a lot of farming communities around my high school, and FFA was pretty important to our school community. But it's also, students who are doing part-time work or doing summer work. Some of these communities are in maybe bedroom communities or major tourist spots during the summer, right? Park City, Utah is a good example of this. Maybe more affluent, right? Not all rural communities struggle with financial resources, but it is designated as a small town. And that type of community might have more students in high school that are contributing toward their tourism dollars than anything else. And so bring some of those summer experiences as well. And then in terms of the types of schools and the types of experiences students have, I think high schools in rural communities often see small class sizes. And I think that that really relates to maybe liberal arts colleges and those that are not these massive lecture halls. Some colleges obviously are larger than these small towns and have 60, 70,000 students enrolled at those. And that can be a pretty scary, intimidating experience, quite honestly. And so, relating that kind of asset of like, I'm used to small class sizes, I'm used to getting to know adults and teachers and administrators in important ways. And then, of course, overcoming some of those barriers like distance and geography and sometimes cultural barriers, sometimes educational barriers as well.
Yeah, no, I think that's such a I think that those are all really great points. And think for students just to think about some of the things that may not stand out just because it's sort of
Yeah.
commonplace in your community, but might be like different. And perhaps at certain schools there are, opportunities because that is underrepresented in the context of that
Hmm.
school. Which I always think is really, really interesting.
Hmm.
And yeah, I was when I worked in admissions, I was at Kenyon College, really in a really small town in Ohio, and that was yeah, just very cool to have that experience and doing recruitment in different part of the country.
Right.
And definitely very different activities list for my students and rural like Southeast Ohio versus the
Hmm.
students who my home state of New Jersey, which there
Hmm.
are rural places in small town New Jersey, but there's a lot of a lot of suburbs and more urban areas.
Yeah, exactly.
Definitely think there's some real opportunities there. And also to your point about the small classrooms for students, it's just like an important thing to think about the type of environment. If
Hmm.
you are comfortable and you like that type of environment, a liberal arts
Hmm.
school could be a great next
Hmm.
step. Um,
Right.
to transition a little bit, I feel like a lot of work in college admissions and school counseling is just like myth busting. I think
Yeah.
there's so many just, myths, misconceptions, takes that are not, maybe there's a grain of truth, but are just like not inherently correct. What do you see as some of the big misconceptions for rural students and families who are navigating the process?
Yeah, I think some of these misconceptions, they're related to media, they're related to the stories that they hear from others. I think oftentimes students can come at this thinking like college is unattainable or unaffordable, right? What we hear from rural students, because of critical mass issues, there's just not a ton of people in rural areas. And so the people that you know might be really connected to your family, they might go to your church, they may have gone off to college but then came back, and they see that as like a failure narrative, right? Like that they tried it and they couldn't because it was a scary situation or it was intimidating or whatnot. And I think going to school outside of that community is less common, right? So a lot of these rural communities are located in education deserts. There's just no community college or four-year institution anywhere close by. There's some exceptions to that, but that can be pretty typical. And so you see fewer success stories. You see fewer stories of students going off to college, going out of state, going to private institutions. Um, and I think that that's part of their truth, but it can be a misconception that college is just unattainable, right? I think the affordability question is just an unknown. So families are not necessarily thinking about federal or state resources. They might see these really big sticker prices on some of the most expensive private colleges out there and not realize that there's just so much financial aid and scholarships and institutional aid that's afforded to them. Not every college is in the single digit admit rate territory. Very few actually are. And so I think again, you see your student and maybe your student is like really talented at school and you're thinking like they have to go to a really good college or whatnot. And there's a lot of good colleges that don't have IB attached to their name. But you might think like it's just, they're not they don't come to our community. They don't come to our school. We don't see admission officers. There's no college fairs in our community. And so you might just think as a parent or a student, this isn't a pathway that's available to me. And so I think like The reality here is that college is attainable, that, the average admit rate across the country is like, I don't know, 65% or something. And so it's not just the super duper selective places. It's not just the higher sticker costs or really high net prices. Like there's a lot of programs for even middle income families to afford college.
Yeah, we definitely, I think, see on our end at Scholarships 360 just the cost being a huge misconception.
Right.
And the truth is just that the cost of college for most folks is going down. I guess maybe some small percent of really high
Sure.
earners who are attending some of the most, elite schools, they,
Yep.
may be paying more than they were a decade ago. But um yeah, I think I think some of the narratives get a little sensationalized. Also,
Yeah.
student loans a bit, where a lot of that is overwhelmingly like graduate and professional programs,
Exactly.
not
Exactly.
necessarily undergraduate.
Right.
But I think you hit on something really interesting, just the sort of like basic logistical challenge of rural places can just be hard to access for college
Yep.
admissions officers, you know, limited time, get a lot
Yep.
of admissions folks are getting ready to hit the road. Some of them have hit the road,
Hmm.
visiting high schools across the world and doing college fairs and such. Um, this became very apparent to me when I was at Kenyon, and I think especially seeing the lack of college access infrastructure in a lot of
Hmm.
rural communities versus suburban
Hmm.
urban places. I think this can contribute to some of the guidance gap perhaps that you're discussing.
Yeah.
What are some of the like really actionable, like creative ways that you've seen students and families address this? Whether it's just college counseling, test prep, thinking about FAFSA, if you don't, have access in your, directly in your community to some of these resources.
Yeah, I think it starts early. I think, developing college aspirations is a really important experience for younger kids. I mean, elementary school, middle school, research shows that if you're not developing those aspirations by, eighth grade or so, you're far less likely to go to college. And unfortunately, rural schools really do struggle with this. Rural communities struggle with curriculum. There's a lot of research that shows like STEM interests, for example. And in ninth grade, I think STEM interest is the exact same across the board. So there's the same level of STEM interest. But as we get to the end of high school and we get into college, there's far fewer rural students that are actually majoring in STEM. And there's some contributors to this. Curriculum is one of those. And so we know from the last research, this is probably better, quite honestly, but almost half of schools just don't offer an AP curriculum in rural areas compared to maybe 3% in urban areas that don't offer APs, and they have other options like IB and other advanced curriculum, right? And so the curricular piece is one of those pieces. Khan Academy is a good solution or a part of that solution. And so taking different courses, getting certified, mostly in STEM. They have some other courses, but it's mostly in STEM. And then pairing that maybe with live tutoring. And so, it's 2025. A lot of this can be virtual. Doesn't solve everything because there's some broadband issues across the country in rural areas as well. But if you do have access to broadband, pairing that with Schoolhouse.world, for example, getting live tutoring, going through Khan Academy, getting some curricular options in front of you. It might be the local community college. Maybe you do have one in your community. A lot of rural schools have dual enrollment programs where you're taking college classes while you're in high school. Sometimes you can get college credit, sometimes you can. It kind of depends on the institution, but that could be a possible solution. Another one, especially for parents, is advocating for the school to invest in those opportunities. So I took a call a few years ago with Virtual High School. I think it's a nonprofit that offers some curricular options, especially in rural schools, so that calculus can be taught or this advanced, physics course can be taught. I don't think that students can sign up for that directly with Virtual High School. I think the school has to create kind of a contract with them, but that might be an opportunity where parents can advocate as well. So there's some curricular options. I do think it's really important that admission officers that are reviewing applications from rural students don't have the same expectations because it's honestly like icing on the cake if the student is going off and doing summer programs or virtual high school or these sorts of things. But we also do want students to be prepared for their curriculum in college. On the visit piece, There are some specific fly-ins. A lot more money has been made available in the STARS network and others. So there are some new fly-in programs at U Chicago. There's the Emerging Rural Leaders Program. I think it's a week on campus for 9th, 10th, and 11th graders. There are about 80 college fly-in programs writ large across the country by my last count. And a lot of them will consider rural students as part of their diversity and equity lens. And so I encourage rural students, if you're interested in any type of selective college, liberal arts, research, whatnot, look and see if they have a college fly-in program. These are all expenses paid trips to college. Again, it can be kind of a scarier experience for first gen, low income students, students coming maybe not from urban centers. But this is a really good opportunity to get on campus and get in front of admission officers. um, I think the contextual piece here, right? One of those solutions, like you lack access, you lack proximity, et cetera, talk about that in additional information on the comment application. This is a really key way to ensure that the admission officer that's reading your application, that's never read an application from your high school before, knows what's in front of you. Know that my school doesn't offer a physics course. I'm interested in engineering, so I went through Khan Academy, and that's why you're not seeing engineering on my transcript, right? Those are critical contextual pieces that admission officers don't always know. And so advocating for that and for yourself in that section, having a school counselor conversation, making sure that your school counselor might be talking about that in their letter of recommendation. And then kind of the lack of access to information. My organization's really great for that, Matriculate. So if your student is high achieving, 3.5 GPA, on a 4.0 unweighted scale and under $90,000 a year, they can get free college advising for about 3 semesters. So beginning in middle of the junior year and through high school graduation. So it's another opportunity to sort of level the playing field a bit.
Yeah, huge fans of Matriculate. I know, yeah, we've helped make some your opportunities visible to Scholarships 360 students. Big fan of the model. We'll definitely include some links to some of these others. I think these are some great recommendations, Andrew, in the show notes. And I think there is something, not that there's anything wrong with like a traditional college, high school experience where you're kind of going up the honors, AP ladder, it's all offered by
Yep.
your school. That's wonderful. But there is something that is like almost even more impressive for students who are like DIYing some of this and not
Yeah.
feeling like don't be shy about, to your point, don't be shy about sharing that, because that's super,
No.
super impressive that like you've gone above and beyond your high school curriculum. And that's how admissions officers are thinking
Yep.
about you. They're seeing what you did with your set of opportunities in high school, and you've gone
Exactly.
above and beyond, which is that's awesome and speaks like
Yeah.
really just to your curiosity, to your dedication, your diligence. And I'm sure that tracks really well with
Yeah.
college success.
Well, and so if you're a student who is really interested in like English literature and you don't have that outlet in your school and you're now creating a literary magazine with 3 of your friends, that's pretty cool. That might be something that, like, sure, it's, a dime a dozen in urban and suburban schools, and we see it quite often, but something that we might not see in rural schools. And you talking about starting this initiative because you are just interested in this shows intellectual curiosity, shows that you're going above and beyond. So, like, it might seem really small to the student of like, I started this because it didn't exist, but it's actually much larger on the admission side.
Yeah, and to your point, don't be afraid about putting, being very direct about that and the additional
Yeah,
information. Like I've
agreed.
always thought that's just like such a, I think sometimes underutilized part of the Common App, and can just be such a powerful way to add just that bit of context that, to your admissions officer maybe never has read an app from your school, or maybe they're a first
Hmm.
year admissions officer. You don't know who the other person is. And you just want to advocate for yourself and put yourself in the
Yeah,
best possible position.
agreed.
Um, I guess taking a bit of a step back, I'm curious how do you sort of see the typical rural students, you know, s- high school journey? And I guess within that journey, are there specific things or moments that make, attending college more or less likely, or
Yeah.
attending or applying, even just applying for selective colleges more or less likely?
Yeah. Yeah. So it is challenging to talk about the typical experience, right? Because every rural community is pretty different. Rural is not a monolith. We see incredible diversity, quite honestly, across the country, and even across the world. There's lots of rural areas abroad too, and so every journey is different. But I wanted to give a couple of examples, right? So like if we take a student like coastal, if we take a student from Cape Cod and compare that student in this conversation, not in college admissions, by the way, but in this conversation to a student in Western Alaska, they have some commonalities, right? They are coming from smaller communities. They're maybe sort of that isolated town feel in some ways. Both are federally defined, by the way, as rural schools, but the resource allocation is going to be different in those communities. Access it just worlds apart when it comes to those two different communities, right? And so a student in Cape Cod might want to participate in like state or regional science fairs. And, you still have that critical mass issue. You might not have a lot of students in your school that want to do that, right? So that might be a challenge that both of those communities face. But, thinking about paying for or accessing resources for a science fair, like the actual materials that go into an experiment or whatnot, whatever you want to showcase, are going to be pretty different. And so a student on Cape Cod might have access to a Walmart like an hour and a half away. They might have Amazon deliveries, maybe not at the same level as I get in Delaware, but they might have access to that, right? Western Alaska is like a different world when it comes to that. They have to have bush planes that are flown in every couple of months. You have to put your order in for science fairs a couple of months in advance in order to get those science fair materials in front of you, right? Internet is incredibly expensive in Western Alaska. This is based on real life examples, by the way. Like, I've actually talked with school counselors and district leaders in Western Alaska to talk about some of these challenges. And the University of Alaska, like thinking about like, okay, so if I want to go visit, maybe I am in rural Delaware or in Cape Cod or whatnot, I want to go visit some colleges, like you are driving quite a ways, but you're probably just taking a drive to go visit. Western Alaska, the University of Alaska actually charters a flight every year for students in this school district, which
Hmm.
costs about $100,000 to go
Wow.
visit the University of Alaska. Like that's how you're accessing knowledge and social capital and these sorts of things, right? The ability to even just be on campus is an incredibly expensive endeavor. And then you put on sort of a layer of like in Western Alaska, a lot of these students are Alaska Native students. There's some social and cultural differences and educational access differences. And so like when we talk about like typical like that it's hard to identify some typical pieces, but at the same time, there are a lot of commonalities, regardless of what type of rural or small town community. There's usually some kind of lack of highly valued social capital. And so that's knowledge about the college process, that's access to people who have gone to college. Typically, what we see in rural areas are lower rates of college going attendance, right? So in my town, mine was, I wouldn't say like deeply rural or anything, but like I didn't have a lot of role models that went to college. I had teachers, I had my pediatrician. I don't really remember anyone else, quite honestly, that had gone to college, and they weren't actively talking about their college experience with me. So lack of social capital in rural areas is pretty typical. I think we talked about the critical mass piece of like just not having a lot of people that have had that experience or gone on to those experiences. In rural areas, you may or may not have access to other opportunities, right? Higher paying jobs that don't require a college education. That might be working in oil fields, that might be working on your family farm. Maybe the electrician in the town is retiring. Now you're doing an apprenticeship with them and you're becoming the town's electrician that might pay quite a bit more than maybe the first job after college. And so I think a lot of rural students are actually thinking about that of like, do I need post-secondary education? Um, and then, of course, the typical experience that we've already referred to is fewer admission officers visiting these schools. So I founded the NACAC Rural and Small Town Special Interest Group, collection of about 2,000 admission professionals, and about 600 of them were school counselors. We asked those school counselors, like, how many colleges are visiting you on average each year? Because what we're finding in the urban context, like highly resourced public schools, independent schools, it was hovering around 150 colleges in the fall, maybe up to 200 colleges. And so we put out a survey, and I actually asked them, like, how many colleges are visiting you, thinking it's probably pretty low. And I actually had counselors write back and say, "What do you mean colleges are visiting high schools?" Like they had zero because they didn't even know it was a thing, right? And so we do see fewer admission officers in these spaces, which does translate, especially in the selective holistic admissions world, of not having the kind of context that you really need. Whereas in an urban or suburban environment, you might know the school counselor, you might see them at professional associations and conferences and these sorts of things. Even if that doesn't officially translate into differences in the review process, like it can sometimes feel that way, right? And then
Oh, for sure.
right.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we at an independent school I worked at in Connecticut, where a wonderful school, but we turned away. Like we just couldn't even handle
Right,
the number of colleges that wanted to
right,
visit,
right.
and we had generous professional development budgets, and yeah, not to say that it's like that necessarily like translates to results, but just the
Yeah,
familiarity like
yeah,
obviously like does in some way.
yeah. Yeah. And the role of school counselor, right? The role of the school counselor is different in rural schools. So you usually don't have a team of school counselors that you see in like suburban Philadelphia. You usually have one school counselor. Sometimes that's a K-12 school, sometimes it's a high school, but the school counselor is doing scheduling, college counseling, socio-emotional, they're driving the bus, they're teaching, they're, lunchroom aide, like they literally are doing all of it, and they typically don't have access to those professional associations. They don't have access to maybe graduate level coursework and becoming a school counselor and learning about college admissions. So all of these things really translate to less information about the common application, less information about college admissions and QuestBridge and financial aid. And that's going to be a pretty typical experience of the rural student. Obviously, there's some exceptions to that rule. Like we read plenty of rural students when I was at Swarthmore and at Vanderbilt, where they're coming from a rural community, but it's because their mom was the town doctor and they moved from New York City, right? And that's going to be a different lived experience compared to students who sort of grow up in this environment.
Yeah, no, I think, yeah, such a great reminder, because I know in this conversation we're talking about, focus on rural students, but it is not a, monolithic group, and there's just so many, every student's experience is going to be a little bit different, and every place is
Yeah.
also very, very, very different.
Yeah.
Um,
So I think the difference that like there's a couple of different things that I would say in terms of what makes the difference. Like I talked a little bit about developing those aspirations among middle school students, for example, toward college, and that makes a difference, right? Actually having aspirations to go to college. But I think one set is on the college side and one set is on the family side. So on the college side, I would say like we need more folks invested in rural communities, right? We see very few college access organizations, or we call them CBOs, college community-based organizations, in rural spaces. There are some, and there are some initiatives, and so the STARS Network is one example. But there's the Ayers Foundation in Tennessee that embeds school counselor or college advisors into rural schools. Rooted Alliance is in Missouri and a few other states, and Lenfest Foundation is in Pennsylvania. So there are some, but there are relatively few. And we have far fewer admission officers that are actually taking the time, getting in the car, going to those schools. And I think from the leadership standpoint of admissions, you're like, well, you could either hit 4 or 5 schools plus a college fair in a city, or you can do 2 or 3 high schools maybe in a rural area. And so I think that there's questions around return on investment, but you need to show up. I mean, I think relationships are so critical in the rural space. School counselors need to know you. They need to see you every single year to build that trust. And rural communities really are built on a lot of trust, especially from outsiders and coming in. And so that's something that I think college admission officers and colleges can do. And I think, what I referred to earlier is viewing rural students through that DEI lens. They need equitable solutions because they have some challenges that are really particular to geography, and proximity. And so thinking about that diversity perspective and lived experience and being inside of your classroom and having those conversations, I think is really important, and just committing to admitting and enrolling rural and small town students and knowing who they are. And I do work, I'm a consultant with Caltech on their rural initiatives. And like I've worked with them a lot on defining rural and making sure that, we're not giving too much deference to the federal government in defining rural, and that they're really comfortable with that rural definition so that we can track that pipeline. On the high school or on the student side and the family side, I think what makes a difference is getting started early. So not only those aspirations, but like learning about the college admissions process. If you can do it early in high school so that you can make some different decisions on scheduling and curricular options and extracurriculars, great. But, at any point, if you have families even in their senior year, rising senior year, like get started now. That's what I'm doing at AskDrHoffman.com. So I'm actually created a Parents Ultimate college admissions course. It's A to Z, getting started researching, but also all about the college admissions process, all about need-based financial aid, scholarships, those sorts of things, and making that type of coursework available so that it's on your own. You can do this over the next couple of months. It's about 6 hours and almost 100 different lessons that you can take. So try not to be intimidating, but there's just a lot of pieces that I think families need to know about, and educating yourself on that front. And I think that's really important. We also have free newsletters and we have free YouTube channel as well, so you can get some additional things outside of the courses. But it's a subscription model essentially. We do offer waivers for low income families too, so that's easily accessible, and we can provide that. And I'm happy to provide a coupon code to your listeners. They can get money off. And so I think that that's really important, though, is like educating yourself, because otherwise you're sort of in the dark. And I see a lot of families over my admissions career kind of like, how does this all work? And like, Scholarship 360 is a great resource. Free webinar is a great resource, but like, it's something different to like walk through a curriculum of what exactly you need to know so that you're prepared for that experience.
Totally. And I think college is it's a big investment of time, it's a big investment of money. And I love the focus on parents as stakeholders, just,
Yeah.
not in many, but not all situations. Parents, they're the buyers. They're gonna be very,
Yep.
very involved with that. So I love that, creating a guided resource. And we'll definitely
Yeah.
include the links to all of the above and the notes. As we wrap up, was curious one kind of last question, just like based, I'm sure sounds like parents have been a focus of yours of late
Mhm.
and have been spending some time thinking about that. What is like one just piece of advice you'd give the, parents who might be listening to this, who are, going through the process with their child?
Yeah. I think putting all options on the table is really important for families. We're speaking to families. Some have gone to college and have their own experience. Some have not gone to college, but their students interested. Some have not gone to college and they're skeptical. I think we're talking to a pretty diverse audience, quite honestly, when we talk to parents. But I think committing to like putting the options on the table. Let's talk about this. If you can do it sophomore year, great. Like that's wonderful. If you can talk about 4 years and 2 years and community colleges and tech school and apprenticeship and military and all of the sort of post high school options, educating yourself on those options, I think is important, especially if you just don't know a ton about it. And really try not to limit your own student based on your own perceptions or lived experiences, right? And so we have a neighbor actually, who just told us, well, we didn't go to college and we're doing just fine. And that why should my kids go to college, right? That might be an okay option for your student as long as they've gone through the exercise of thinking, well, how is this going to change my life, or is it not going to change my life, right? Like, I don't think we should just assume because you're financially capable, without a college education, that's automatically going to translate to your student. The economy is changing. These are different times. My own personal story, my parents were not supportive, quite honestly, about going to college. It's not that they were actively dissuading me from going to college, but they were like, we don't know how how this works. If you go to college, we're not paying for it, and you're gonna have to get a scholarship. And, it's discouraging, quite honestly. But had I known, oh, there is need-based financial aid available, there are some scholarships available, I charted my own path. But, I think having parents or family members in your corner to like at least support you. Support comes in a lot of different ways, right? Financial support, of course, if you can financially support your student toward this journey, great. The US government relies on families to help whenever they can, but there is a lot of need-based financial aid. There's some loan assistance, et cetera. But even access to your financial information is actually really critical. And students can't really apply for financial aid unless they do have access. Even if you're like, we can't afford anything, and that's okay. Some families are in that situation, but at least completing the free application for federal student aid and ensuring that your student has access to that information. We talked about knowledge about the college process, educating yourself, and then helping your student. But really just like trying to work together. If you could take them on college visits, that's great. If you can't, encourage virtual visits and meet with them on a regular basis to talk about it. So I think that just general support, quite honestly, to ensure that your students know their options and know that these things are possible, and having really open and honest conversations is just my best piece of advice that I offer in my course. I offer in my newsletters. I talk to parents all the time, because I just think having those conversations, as opposed to getting to the end of senior year and like hoping for the best, like it's not a good strategy.
Yes, no, I love that advice, Andrew. I think that's a wonderful way to wrap up. Just that it is not a one size fits all thing. I know, just kind of on the on the flip side, when I was in the independent school world, it was like the prescriptive solution was, you must go to the highly selective
Right.
Ivy League type of school, which is kind of the same thing. It's not the best fit for every student. For some students, sure. Also, just those schools are very, as far as goal setting, that's very hard to get into, even for very
Right.
qualified students. So I love kind of framing this as like, you're there to be a support and to help the student, help your child understand what the
Yeah.
options are available to you. And there's a number of like exciting options, and just being really level-headed as you assess them and whether they're a
Yeah.
good fit for you.
Yeah.
Um,
Absolutely.
well, thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah.
Where's the best place for people to find you afterwards with
Yeah.
more content?
I think my website is the perfect place because it has links to all my social media. My social media handle is
Perfect.
Ask Dr. Hoffman. You can pretty much find me anywhere, but AskDrHoffman.com. And there's a parents course that's alive right now. I'm working on a student one. I'm working on a counselor one. There's a lot of pieces here, but I would highly recommend just go to the website, sign up for more information. So I have a monthly newsletter that goes to the parent based on the age of your child. So if your student is a freshman, I have a whole newsletter series for you, and if your student is a senior, it's a different newsletter. And students get a very similar content, but it's also based on where they are. And that's all free. The newsletter is free. The YouTube channel is free. Sign up, subscribe. You can get new content each week. But if you're really seriously thinking about like, I need to learn as much as I can, I highly recommend don't trust random people on the internet. Like I see this all the time on Reddit. I'm sure you do too as well, Will. Like we see all of this bad information out there. Like don't trust just because a student got into Harvard, this is what they wrote their essay about, this is what you should do. Like don't trust that. Trust people who have been in the room, made the decisions, been on the college counseling side, folks like us. And I really want to do this because I want to help more people.
Yeah, I think that's wholeheartedly agree. We'll include that in the show notes. And thanks again for joining us, Andrew. This has been great.
Yeah, thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity.
Thanks everyone for tuning to another episode of Office Hours with Will Geiger. If you're a student or parent, don't forget to check out app.scholarships360.org, where you can sign up for our free scholarship matching platform. For colleges, we've got solutions to make your work easier, which you can check out at connect.scholarships360.org. And one last thing, if you or someone you know would make a great guest on the show, I'd love to hear from you. You can always reach me by email or on LinkedIn. Until next time, thanks again for listening.